Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're just hitting the top of the hour, so we will kind of wait and see as others join. My name is Lynn Walsh. I'm here again after Module 1. So here again as we're nearing the end. Glad to be back with you. And then I'm also here with Julia.
Hi everyone, I'm Jules. I'm with SJN. Very happy to be joining you all today on this module with Lynn. I've learned so much from Lynn. And as Lynn mentioned, we'll wait for some more folks to come on in, but we're here today for office hours and for you to bring forth any questions that might have come up on while you were doing this module.
Yeah, so feel free if you want to, turn your video on. If you have a question ready to go, feel free to put it in the chat or kind of raise your hand. We can jump straight to those as we're still kind of waiting for people to join. Just a couple of reminders and announcements. One, this is being recorded. And so after this is recorded, you will be able to find it inside the module. So if you are taking this with anyone else who couldn't make it, they can find it there. They can watch it later. You could watch it later. The other reminder is that even though this is ending soon, you still will have a couple weeks to complete everything and still get a certificate. So please keep that in mind. I know that certificate can be so important. So you still have some time to complete that, even though the course may be ending. And in addition, this course will live on beyond that, and it's asynchronous. So you can come back to this, work on it, review it later on as well.
That's right. And we hope it lives on in your hearts as well as you continue to bring this to your election coverage. We're so excited about being able to teach these skills this year. It's so timely. So yeah, +1 to Lynn.
Yeah, okay, so there's already a question. Yes, so we are going to speak on the mitigation of polarization. And so I don't see too, I mean, there are a couple of people still joining, but I don't know. Let's go ahead. Let's go ahead and get started, I think. And I'll just kind of quickly reintroduce myself, and Jules, if you want to do the same. My name is Lynn Walsh, and I'm the Assistant Director at Trusting News. At Trusting News, we work to help journalists rebuild trust with their audience. A big part of that is transparency, which you've already heard me talk about. And if you completed module 1, it was a part of that. The other big part of that, though, is how can we prevent polarization in our coverage? Better listen, better understand our audiences to better cover them, provide content for them that they want to engage with and they find useful.
Fantastic. Sorry if you hear a very loud horn in the background, but I'm Jules. I'm here with the Solutions Journalism Network. Our mission is to help journalists and newsrooms report rigorously on responses to problems with evidence-backed results. And we also see as part of our mission to tell the whole story on a problem. And so often, problems, particularly problems in America, the problems that surface during election season, are very much characterized by polarization. The idea of trying to solve a problem seems off the table when two parties can't even agree on what the problem is. So, as part of that work, we have supported a framework of reporting called Complicating the Narratives. And what that means is it's applying the conflict or applying the concepts of conflict mediation to your reporting. And practically, that means learning how to listen better, how to ask questions to get people motivations, all of the things that you hopefully went through during the module. So we're super excited to be here today and answer any questions that might have come up as you were taking it.
Yeah, and again, if anyone has any specific questions, we'd be glad to go to you now. Again, you can use the chat at any time. It's open for you. You can also raise your hand or unmute yourself. I'll kind of pause to see if there is anything or any questions. If not, I'm not seeing any. I think I can go ahead. Jules, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the interviews, like some of the videos that you included for the module?
Absolutely, Lynn. I could talk about that. And I can also talk about one question that's actually come up on the discussion forum that might be something you all are wondering too. It was definitely a question I had when I started this work. So just to recap, the videos that I helped to facilitate were actually interviews with the pioneers of this. One comes from Amanda Ripley. She wrote the essay Complicating the Narratives back in 2018. It kind of broke the internet because so many journalists were resonating with this message of just feeling like how, hopeless sort of and powerless in reporting on issues in America when there's so much polarization. So Amanda spent a year really learning from folks in the field, from conflict mediators, rabbis, priests, whatnot, therapists, to come up with a set of tools that journalists can use to listen better. One of them that you might have had a chance to practice is called looping. And what that means is when you, as the journalist, ask a question and you hear your source answer, before you ask another question, you actually loop back what they said. You sort of paraphrase it and you check your understanding. And when you do that, you give your source an opportunity to say, no, you didn't understand that, or let me explain what I meant. And in this process of looping, even if it's someone you totally disagree with, what you're doing there is you're building trust. Because one of the facts to come out of Amanda's research is that it's impossible to build trust and to ask questions until people really feel heard. So that was our first video. And then we did some interviews with journalists who were part of our Complicating the Narratives Fellowship, who adopted Amanda's techniques in their reporting. One comes from our friend Alexis Allison, who did this amazing project at the Fort Worth Report, bringing together two people who have opposing stances on a health issue and using these Complicating the Narrative techniques to see where and if they might have common ground to sort of build this understanding and trust. And another comes from our friend Chris Green at the Kansas Leadership Center. And so you could check those out. They have some great resources in there about, what's worked to help them in their reporting. But one of the questions that I wanted to bring up in this was this question of time, right? I mentioned this technique looping. Looping is, again, when you loop back what your source has said before you ask another question. And we had this very reasonable question from someone saying, how do journalists have time to do that? Let's say they're on deadline. Let's say they're on air. How is it that, they can proceed with looping? And to that, we would say, you do have to sort of know your context. If you have a 2-minute broadcast, yeah, that's probably not a great opportunity for looping. Looping tends to work really well when it's a long form podcast, when you do sort of have this unlimited time. But I think that this is a situation of quality over quantity, right? So if you come into your interview, let's say you have 10 questions prepared, but this is with a source who, might not be so willing to trust media, might have felt misrepresented by media before. Maybe cut the number of questions down and spend some time really looping them. And then worst comes to worst, you could always do another interview. You could sort of triangulate what they say with other sources. So that would be my advice on that note, although I do know that it's easier said than done as journalists on a deadline.
Yeah, Allison has chimed in here. I was asking if anyone has used looping in their own reporting and if anyone has tried it. And Allison says that she didn't realize it was called looping, but she does like to check to make sure that she's understanding properly what is being said. She said she's new at this. I'm assuming maybe Allison, and if you want to unmute yourself and talk more, we'd love to hear from you. But new at maybe the reporting or journalism. So she's terrified of misunderstanding and looking like she's taking something out of context. And I think, I definitely can relate to that. And I think always wanting to make sure to get information correct. I think looping is a little different though, correct? Or how would you it's not just following up to make sure you're getting information correct, but it's more of kind of pushing to get information and understanding of like maybe difficult maybe hot button issues? I don't know. How would you compare those two things?
I think it's both. And plus one to Lynn. Thank you, Allison, for bringing that up. I'm in the same exact boat. And I actually think that's all the reason why it's so important to loop. Better to try to check your understanding while you're in the interview than to come out with the story and then find out actually you took it out of context, which we're all, guilty of doing at times. So I would say to Lynn's point that looping, you can kind of think of it as an inverted, as a V, right? So you sort of ask that surface level question at first, or you might ask a question like, tell me about how you came to understand this issue in this way. And by the way, there's a resource, 22 questions that complicate the narrative to help with them. And then as the person answers, you do actually want to check your understanding, check to make sure that you have correctly understood what they said. Again, that is not the same as agreeing with what they said. But then once your source has an opportunity to say, yeah, that's right, that's when you can sort of go a little bit deeper, go beneath the motivation of how this person came to believe this. Maybe there were experiences in their childhood. Maybe there are experiences they have now that could be contributing to why they have such strong feelings on this. And then what's really cool when you come up the other side of the V, that's when you have the opportunity, once this deep trust is built, to expose them to the other side, expose them to how somebody might be thinking about the same issue differently. And a really beautiful example of this is on the health story that is included in the interview that Alexis did with the priest and the doctor who disagree on abortion. Um, so yes, and to Abdulaziz's comment, looping could also be applied to get more information. That's right. When you're sort of looping, there might be an opportunity in there to say, wait, actually, I didn't quite understand that. Could you tell me what you mean by that? Or maybe, you've heard what they said and you want to inject a little bit of your own reasoning about what that means. Looping is an opportunity to do that, but to do it with the source so that they're sort of like fact checking you in real time to make sure that you got that right. So I love this discourse happening in the chat.
Mhm. Yeah, if anyone has, again, other questions, again, the chat is open. And you can also feel free to unmute yourself as well or raise your hand and we can come to you. As we're kind of waiting for more discussion, I can talk a little bit about some of the trusting news content that was included and kind of how this whole issue of polarization and really not taking time to listen can actually lead to this distrust, right? And so if you've taken the first module, you learned a little bit about commonalities between what people who distrust in news, why they do, what leads to that distrust. But some other things that we know leads to distrust is, often people don't feel like their views are represented by the content being produced, or they feel as if everything is so sensationalized, it's over generalized, everyone's kind of put into a box and described as one thing. So if you take an issue like abortion, journalists often like to say you're either pro-choice or you're pro-life, but often people's views are a lot more complicated than that. And so if they don't see their views reflected, it can turn them off by the content in general, but it also just means we are contributing to the polarization that exists in this world. And so what we are trying to do at Trusting News is try to see how can journalists prevent contributing to polarization. And so we ask the question, how can journalists and reporting, highlight complexity and basically fuel curiosity without adding to polarization? And a couple things that we talk about is the need to highlight moderate voices. So not always taking that soundbite that has the person yelling the most outrageous quote, the most extreme viewpoint. We also talk about how you can stop that overgeneralization. Also, how you can be really careful and pay attention to word choice. People pay very close attention to the words that are used, especially in headlines. And so we've actually developed this anti-polarization checklist, which is linked in the course, but I'll put it here in the chat as well. The idea is that this is meant for reporters and editors throughout the reporting process to ask themselves questions about their stories, about story framing. Are they framing this story to be all about a problem, or are they looking actually for possible solutions to things or how people are working together? People like to see stories like that. Are they paying? And then the other thing is, what kind of sources are you using? Who are you talking to? Who are you not talking to? Do you have representation from all of the voices that are in your community, or at least a good variety of them? So that polarization checklist, we've had journalists use it primarily with political coverage. And the idea is that, again, you use it throughout the reporting process. It's meant to give you just a pause to say, is there anything I could change maybe in this headline? Should I go back and talk to another source? And so that is there as a tool for you to use. And kind of a big, when we know when journalists have used it, they have felt that their reporting has more context and goes a little bit deeper into the issues and can be more helpful for their community.
I love that, Lynn. It's so relevant. And actually, it speaks to a question that iPhone 2 has raised, which is about explaining as a journalist how and why political polarization in the US has reached such a radical situation. More specifically, do you believe that the democratic system is really in danger? Um, I'm happy to just share a little, but I think, Lynn, you have much more expertise on this. I will say that a lot of the things we're talking about today, a lot of what has been discussed in this module, unfortunately, is a consequence of how journalists in the past, sometimes, often to no fault of their own, to no awareness of their own, have contributed to this polarization. And it's not their fault. The climate is really tough. And as a journalist, of course, we see these extreme opinions and we think that they're such a threat to democracy, and so we report on them. And um we inadvertently, I think, kind of contribute to the polarization, because it's partially because of what Lynn has just said, right? That we tend to report on the loudest and most extreme voices. We tend to not be so curious about how they came to be so loud and extreme. And when we do that, we give more Americans permission to do the same. So I think that's why our work is so important now, to sort of correct this by amplifying, the complexity of the positions that people hold. Lynn, do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you really hit on a lot of the major points. I think, when we talk about at Trusting News, the problem of trust, we definitely like to make sure that we highlight that there are things journalists can do, and that is what we are focused on. There are definitely things that have contributed to this distrust in news and information of journalists that are beyond journalist control, right? And so, yes, there are things that I think, with the question, like, how did it reach this kind of radical situation? I think they're definitely the way people use social media and consume content online, I think definitely has contributed to some of that as well. Now, as journalists, that's not necessarily something we have control over. We don't control algorithms of the social media companies or what Google decides to highlight and not highlight, right? And then, you do have the fact that politicians have totally pushed the idea of trying to be the most extreme in some cases and or attack kind of the um, just the accuracy and trustworthiness of news and information. So there's more to it than that. What we like to focus on, though, is that, one, we do believe journalists have a role and have contributed to this, and there are things that we can do differently. And personally, I think some of this is that, if we're honest, sometimes it's easy to highlight that politician that likes to say maybe the most crazy or extreme thing. It's something that we know people will react to. And I guess what I like to kind of ask journalists and kind of go back to is, if we really see ourselves as something that we are serving the public? Is highlighting that extreme view the best service of the public? And I would argue it's not, because when you do dig deeper, you realize people's views on a lot of issues are actually not that extreme. It just appears that they are because that's what the loudest voice is getting the most attention, the easiest to highlight. And so it takes a little bit more work, may not be as fun or maybe not get as many clicks, but I do think people will appreciate it more. It's more helpful. It's more to that public service of what journalism is. And I hope that's what everyone's goal is here.
Absolutely, Lynn. So, so well said. And such a great call to action for us. And as you were mentioning that, Allison had a really great reflection in the chat, one I can totally relate to, of the challenge of being a new journalist. And you know, as you're repeating back what you're heard, especially if you like really disagree with it's hard not to be baited into a debate, right? It's hard not to want to prove them right and give them information that would, challenge this viewpoint. And Allison, feel free to come off mute and elaborate if I'm not looping your question properly or your reflection properly. But I think that it's very widely shared among veteran journalists. How do you not engage in those debates? And especially to your second point, if you're talking to someone with extreme views, it's like you want to make sure that you're not on their side or the other side or any side. And I think that's such a normal human tendency when we hear information that's extreme that we have strong opinions about. We feel the need, I think, to like position ourselves to it. What I like about complicating the narratives and this specific resource that was shared during that module, it's called the 22 questions to complicate the narrative. It almost it almost it's such a good guidepost for being curious about the understory of their position, right? It almost is like if you're at the bowling alley, it's like your bumpers from getting from getting into that territory of debate or disagreement or proving right. What this is so focused on is just being so curious about how that position came to be, as opposed to whether it's accurate. Now, in your story, for example, you might have more license and more journalistic responsibility if someone says something that's absolutely outrageously untrue and you feel it's important to include that in part of the story. That's where it could be your job as a journalist to say, like, by the way, that's not true. But in that conversation, when you're guided by these questions and guided by the looping, I almost think it takes us out of that tendency to want to debate or correct. Um, yeah, Allison, did you want to
Yeah,
just
for some
go ahead?
reason I can't raise my hand, and I feel awful about jumping in because you guys are really you're on a roll. I want to like jump in and say anything, but it won't let me raise my hand. It gives me the option of play chime for raised hands or recognized hand gestures, but I don't actually have the hand. I can't find it. Anyway, um,
It's all
so
good.
I guess I am new, so I've actually only been out of J school for about 2 years. But I was working as an investigative journalist, and we were covering this story about this cult in Canada, this Queen of Canada cult. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but anyway, here I am talking to. I think everybody that I talked to when we were doing this investigation had an extreme view. I would consider an extreme view politically, kind of the polarized views. And I also encountered a lot of people who were very, very nervous about journalists, or they didn't like journalists because I guess what's happening down south. So I'm in Canada. So like down south, you guys are they have the whole Trump thing, right? But so I found that I had to really be careful when I was talking to people who hated journalists. I don't know how you can hate all journalists, but anyway, or um, had really, really strong kind of views, to not have any kind of inflection in my voice or on my face that reflected that I was like disagreeing or agreeing too strongly with them one way or the other. And I found that kind of a difficult line to balance.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally, I can totally understand that when you are recognizing, you in Canada, us in the States, same thing, that there is a certain perception, opinion about journalists, that there is this history of journalists sort of misinterpreting or misunderstanding, that, you're focused on not trying to fall into that trap. I do it
Plus,
too.
too, like I don't want them to think that I'm trying to trip them up or that I'm trying to be fake news or that I'm trying to like misrepresent them. And I just find that a lot of my time is just really trying to reassure, to get that trust, to reassure them that, you know what, I just want to know what the story is. I just want to tell the story and I want to hear what you think. And it's not about what I think politically, it's not about where I stand. It's really just, I'm interested in what you have to say. And I find that maybe you could give me some advice on how to shorten that conversation because one of my editors at a paper I worked for once told me I had 20 minutes to interview and would roll her eyes and sigh quite heavily when she found out that it's 2 hours later and I'm still in the same interview. But maybe like some kind of suggestions on how to reassure people that um, I'm I've come to praise Caesar, not to bury him. But no, I just want your opinion. I'm not here to trick you or to do anything bad. Like I find that coming into this to journalism in this climate is a real challenge. Thank you.
Yeah, it definitely is. A couple things that I would just add is, so I think, unfortunately, I wish that we could all journalists spend 2 hours, interviewing someone. I totally understand that's just not possible with deadlines and can in what just exists. And so the first thing I would say is think about what is your goal with this story you're telling. So maybe the goal with this one story you're telling is to help people better understand this group. Like, let's say the example you gave, your goal is to share the viewpoints, make people aware that this group exists. And maybe that's the extent of it. Being very transparent about that, being very honest with your sources, and then explaining how, when I'm telling the story, I want people after they read the story to know what you think, what you represent, what your goals are, kind of talking very directly. And I think that also will help you possibly kind of guide the conversation. It may also maybe cut that in half because you're being very transparent up front. The other thing you can always do, and in the module, when we talk about creating mission statements for your election coverage, well, the mission goes beyond election coverage, though. It goes for all of your coverage. Like, what are your goals? What are you trying to accomplish? What sets you apart as a journalist? Having that list ready and kind of reiterating what you're always trying to do, you're going to fact check, you're working to be accurate, you're working to get facts to help the community, right? So kind of having that readily available and explaining that and being ready for them to say, well, I had a journalist who didn't do that before and say, I'm really sorry to hear that. I'm not going to operate that way. I can promise you when you tell me something, this is what's going to happen. The other thing I would say is maybe though, you have stories that go a little deeper. Maybe the point of the story is to actually really understand why this person in this group feels this way. Where did they come from? Is it something that they grew up with? Is it something that happened in childhood? Like whatever it might be, like have a kind of deeper conversation. That's where the looping may really come in handy, right? It's going to be a useful tool and you're going to spend more time with that person and have that ability to. But that's kind of a different story. That looks a little bit different than kind of that basic story, maybe of here's what people think in this group, here's what they represent, here's what their goals are. So I hope that was helpful.
I love what you shared, Lynn.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we were going to suggest very little things. I think what you explained to the group just now about your intentions so beautifully, like I think that could go over well if you had a similar conversation with your source. Another just one tiny thing I'll add as well, although Lynn really covered it, that I learned as part of the fellowship that I managed with or we sent journalists in, or journalists sent themselves in to report on some of the most, polarizing and complicated issues. One of them was a journalist who went to Philadelphia to cover, their addiction, their epidemic, and what's working to, reduce harm in that. And the journalist who was working on this, Rachel Wisniewski, a freelancer who has, through her whole career, done very, very, very sensitive reporting. And even her, she had a really hard time at first, even getting sources to agree to that initial conversation. I think in part of that outreach, I think she did exactly what Lynn said of just, explaining her intentions, apologizing sort of for any mistreatment that's happened in the past, and also linking to some of her other stories. Like, hey, this is, and not to, not to like, push her own work, but sometimes people really want to see like kind of money where their mouth is. And I think that really helped Rachel, and hopefully could help you as well.
Yeah, my supervisors, you use that term in journalism, but like people who've been like mentors to me have suggested that I do the same thing. Like in my emails, I always link to work that I've published so that people get a sense of what I do and that I'm really not out there to get anybody. I'm just looking for your perspective, I suppose. But I do feel like sometimes I'm being baited for sure into or people get I once like I'm really careful about not giving any kind of personal anything personal about myself because one of my sources I she asked how I was doing and I said, "Oh, well, I have COVID because I'm a bad person and worked while I had COVID." But I didn't go to work. I worked from home, but I did work through COVID. And then she got really, really mad at me and told me there was no such thing as COVID and then she spent like a really, really, really long time explaining why I was wrong. And so I like trying to say is that looping back, like how do you get it? Just like I didn't know how to handle that situation. What I ended up doing was just telling her that we'll have to agree to disagree, and I'm just sick, but I'm fine. I'll be fine, and we went on. So anyway, that's a challenge that I've had. Just to give you an example of being baited into conversations, because it sounds like people are trying to get me to be angry, and they're not. They're just trying to convince me of what they believe, and I don't really. Yeah. Anyway, that's it.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think, unfortunately, the reality is that, being a journalist nowadays is just a lot more complicated by a lot of things, but one of it being just this the polarizing just world that we live in and all the polarization that does exist. And I think it does make the job harder and it can be difficult. And I think one thing is to keep in mind and think about what you are like, how much are you sharing about yourself? You also can always feel free to say, thank you for the phone call. Unfortunately, right now, this isn't a time that I have to talk about this. Maybe you want to offer to set up an additional time. Maybe you don't. And that's okay too. I mean, some of those boundaries are important, and something that we talk about at Trusting News is that, remember, even though you have some maybe difficult conversations with some people, that's not everyone. That's not everyone. There's a lot more people that are there in the middle that want to have these conversations, that are going to be willing to listen to you about how journalism works, that are going to want to tell their story. It might take some convincing because of the relationship that's been built over time, unfortunately, and the rhetoric. But you can always feel free to tell someone, this is not the time. Unfortunately, maybe set up another time, maybe not, and kind of know when to set those boundaries. I see a couple comments in the chat here that I'll just highlight, from Wanja, who says that she likes to go into an interview with a clear mind, in this case, find solutions, trying not to inflame or incite polarizing discourse. In that, she's been in journalism 20 years in the profession, still make mistakes. And, sometimes we fail to ask questions and help different sides find common ground. but doing journalism with a conflict sensitive lens is very useful. Thank you for sharing that, both Allison and Wanja.
Do we have any other folks who might have some questions they want to share either in the chat or they can come off mute and ask?
Well, as people are maybe waiting or kind of typing, I'll go over just a couple of those reminders again. This is being recorded, so if you have a friend that was participating or a colleague, they can come back and watch this, or you can come back and watch this. It'll be in the module. Also, there is still time to complete your certificate for a couple weeks after the course. So if you're a little bit behind, don't get discouraged. You still have a little bit of time. And beyond just the certificate, this will live on longer than that, and you can still come back to it because it at your own pace, because it is asynchronous. Well, if no one else has any other questions, I mean, you're still here. So if you don't be shy, feel free to put your question again in the chat. You can also unmute yourself if you would like.
Anyone else? And thank you for everyone who has asked a question and has contributed to the chat. We're so glad to hear this is resonating. It's making you think. And, you know, as Lynn said, we hope that these tools have been useful for you as you continue your election coverage and beyond.
And if there aren't any, oh yes, go ahead.
No, I just want to say thank you. Also, just that the tools actually how to cover elections. I think that this has been a really good course because I love the idea of integrating, telling people up front what you're going to do, how you're going to cover the election. I love putting that in your story, integrating that into your story so that people know that you don't have one view or the other. I guess that's where I just always trying to find that balance of letting people know that I don't support the left or the right. I'm just kind of nobody. I'm like Switzerland. I don't know. I just so I really like when I think there's a huge takeaway from me for this course, even though I don't do a lot of like breaking news reporting or that sort of thing, but just learning about how to integrate your ideas into your story so that it builds transparency. I love that. So I just wanted to say thank you while I had you here and nobody else is talking anyway. I thought just take the opportunity to thank you both for your work. It's amazing. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Allison. And, you know, I think it's something that's important to just kind of keep in mind is, again, it's when people don't understand why we're doing something, they're making an assumption. And unfortunately, right now, that assumption with journalism is probably going to be negative. And so anything we can do to explain our intentions can help interrupt that assumption, kind of fill that information void, and can help build trust. And I think, you know, the other thing is, as journalists, we appreciate and expect transparency in a lot of places. And I think, you know, we have for years kind of not maybe been as transparent as we could be. And now we have an opportunity to have some humility, to meet people where they are, talk to them as fellow community members, right? And kind of really explain what we are trying to do, which ultimately, hopefully, is helping them better understand the world around them. And if that's our goal, and you really are able to capitalize and act on that and show that in your work, people are going to love that. They're going to have that trust that's going to build. So thank you, Allison. I'm glad you found that helpful. And hopefully if you do any of this too, please feel free to send links and stuff. We'd love to see them in the forum. Feel free to link. And I see another question, Jules.
Yeah, I'm happy. I was going to say, I'm happy to try to loop back Denise's question, which seems to be about, you know, to combat polarization, to build trust, to listen better. The question is, should we include two faces of an interview issue? Should we balance out our interviewees' answers? I would say that, you know, I think that's a tempting format. Even sometimes I hear myself speaking, I say things like both sides, right? And if we're in America, you know, especially in our two-party system, I think, are sort of primed to believe that there's two sides to an issue. I think that what Lynn's incredible work and the work of Complicating the Narratives tries to show is that that's actually a little bit of a false binary, that there is a whole spectrum, as Lynn was saying earlier, there's a whole spectrum of positions and opinions that exist out there. And we often don't hear what else is on that spectrum. We often hear the extremes. So I would say in some cases, like the health story example I referenced, where there's a reverend and a doctor who disagree on abortion. That was an example of a format where, yeah, it did make sense to bring two people together who disagreed. But I think through that conversation and through the format, people saw that actually, wait a minute, they agree on a lot of common fundamental things. This is sort of a false binary. So even though that headline was a little bit like, ooh, enticing, this is going to be a sort of one versus one, what readers learned in the story was it was no, actually a sort of a deepening of perspectives and an exploration of just how much common ground there is. Lynn, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that.
Yeah, so I love just kind of building off that example of that story. So one of the things we look at is the story framing, right? So to avoid polarization, you could interview two people who maybe have differing views on a topic. But maybe then when you set it up, you're explaining here's where people who say they have the opposite viewpoints agree, here's where they disagree. So you're framing that a little bit differently because, and then what that does potentially is by providing the information that way, you are allowing people to see, okay, one, now, if I have a viewpoint on one side or the other, or another view in between, I'm not going to instantly think that someone who maybe doesn't agree with me, we don't agree with anything. I'm not going to avoid them. I'm going to be maybe more willing to have a conversation, to talk with them about the issue, or to work with them to find a solution, right? So we are potentially allowing people to see that, hey, you can talk to one another. Don't be afraid. Don't close the other person out, which I think is an important part of journalism, allowing for constructive conversation. Potentially also what that does is allow people to see, hey, there might be a way that we can find a solution that actually helps more people, that more people would agree with, would help the community, even though it seems like our views are different. We do have some commonalities. Let's see how we can build off of those, right? And so that's kind of one example where, yes, you're highlighting or maybe talking to two different people who have those two different viewpoints, but the way you're framing it is actually what potentially could help avoid that polarization. And then I would also say it's not always, the two viewpoints. Often there are views that are much more complicated, much more nuanced. And so can we do a better job of framing them that way? When we've worked with newsrooms on this, one journalist said, what if when you ask someone like what their view is on a topic or how they would identify politically, you let them choose their label? Maybe it's not one word. Maybe it's 5 words that describes their feelings on something. Would we be okay including all of those 5 words instead of trying to pick one term, one box that we want to put them in? And I love that suggestion. And again, it takes a little more time. It's taking up a little more space, but we're allowing for that nuance and that complexity, which what we kind of know when we look at some of these issues, people's views are more complex and more nuanced than just being anti this, pro this.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And thank you, Denise, for asking that question. That's we hear that, we've heard that a lot. So yeah, it's great that you've asked it and we've had some clarity there.
The other thing I would add that just came to mind is when we've worked with journalists on avoiding polarization, it's also how we describe like things and issues too. So an example that here in the United States with immigration, if as a newsroom, you're covering a bill or a potential law and lawmakers are describing it as an anti-immigration law, or a pro-immigration law. Well, when we adopt that language, we are also potentially contributing to that polarizing landscape that exists in that topic. So yes, it's people's viewpoints, but it's also the words we use to describe what's happening, including laws that are being passed. And instead, could we use the actual law's name, and could we add more nuance? Because a lot of times there aren't a lot of laws that are totally against immigration. It might be limiting immigration or allowing for more immigration, right? But they're not totally against, right? And so it was interesting to have journalists talk about that and hear from their community about how that language and those descriptions can really kind of set a tone in their mind if they have strong views on the issue. And in some cases, have them avoid the story altogether because they already make an assumption about what your story is going to be about and the kind of bias that it might have. We're nearing the end here. I'm not sure if anyone else has any other questions. Really appreciate everyone who has shared questions, shared there's different situations they've been in and things they've learned from experience. That was really great. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much to everyone. Thank you to Lynn also. I can hear you talk for hours. So, and luckily now with this course, and with this sort of lasting access to it, I can, and you all can too. And yeah, we hope that it continues to be helpful. We've loved following along on the discussion forums as well. So please continue to check out the material, and yeah, thank you so much.
Yes. And again, just a reminder, please, continue to share and contribute to the forum. Again, you still have a couple weeks to complete this to get your certificate. So if you're a little bit behind, don't worry. It'll be here. This video is going to be here. Tell colleagues they can watch this if they didn't get a chance to be here live. And we just really appreciate all the work that you are doing. And hopefully you see the work that solutions journalism is doing as complementary to building trust, because it really, really is. And building trust is so important to what we are doing now if we want people to consume our accurate, ethical, responsible reporting.
Absolutely to that. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great
Thanks,
rest
everyone.
of the day.
Bye.